Hello, everyone. Today's story is about a woman who found a compass rose pendant in a bookshop cafe identical to the one she'd hidden away for 47 years. The man she'd left behind in 1977 had kept his pendant. All his life, had come back to find her, and died just 3 miles away still wearing her coordinates around his neck. This is their story. This pendant, it's identical to my mother's. Same coordinates, same inscription. But my mother's is still locked in her jewelry box at home. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the brass compass rose lying on the cafe table. Her heart fracturing with the impossible realization the man she'd abandoned 47 years ago had kept his pendant all this time, had worn it every single day, had loved her across decades and distance and death itself, and she'd never known he'd come back to find her, had walked past her bookshop 100 times, had died just 3 miles away still wearing her coordinates around his neck. The cafe walls seemed to close in as the elderly Chinese woman quietly said, "My brother Samuel never took it off, not even on his deathbed." The rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Reading Nook, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet afternoon. Margaret Hartwell had ducked inside her daughter's bookshop cafe purely by chance, her regular route home blocked by road construction. The sudden downpour catching her without an umbrella. She sat near the window, warming her hands around a cup of Earl Grey, watching raindrops race down the glass. The shop smelled of old books and fresh-baked scones, a combination that always brought her comfort. At the counter, Julia was helping a young woman, Lily, her new assistant, organize a display of vintage bookmarks. Their voices carried softly through the nearly empty shop. "Mrs. Chen, could you look at this for a moment?" Lily called to someone in the back room. An elderly Chinese woman emerged, moving slowly but with quiet dignity. She wore a simple cardigan and practical shoes, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "What is it, dear?" she asked. "This pendant, is it yours? I found it on the floor near the poetry section." The woman took the small brass object, examining it closely. "Oh my, no. This isn't mine. But it's beautiful, isn't it?" Lily held it up to catch the light. "There's an engraving on the back. Coordinates, I think. 4339 in, 7015 feet W. And initials. M. H." Maggie's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down carefully, but her hand trembled slightly, causing a faint clink against the saucer. Those coordinates, she knew them by heart. They marked a specific lighthouse on the Maine coast. Pemaquid Point. And M. H. were her initials. Margaret Hartwell. "Excuse me," Maggie heard herself saying, rising from her chair. "I think that might be mine." Julia turned, surprised to see her mother standing there. "Mum? I didn't know you were here." Maggie crossed to the counter, her heart beating faster than it should. She hadn't worn that pendant in 47 years. Hadn't even thought about it in decades. She'd hidden it away after Robert died, along with so many other memories she'd decided were too painful to revisit. Lily held out the compass rose. "Is this yours, ma'am?" Maggie took it, and the weight of it, barely an ounce of brass, felt impossibly heavy in her palm. The metal was cool, slightly tarnished with age. She turned it over. The coordinates were exactly as she remembered. And beneath them, in tiny script, "For the journey we didn't take." "Where did you find this?" Maggie asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Right over there," Lily pointed. "Near the poetry books. It must have fallen from someone's pocket or bag." But Maggie knew better. This pendant hadn't been in anyone's pocket today. She'd kept it locked in a wooden box in her bedroom closet, wrapped in tissue paper, untouched for nearly half a century. Which meant only one thing: there was another pendant. A matching one. Her mind raced back to 1977. The summer she turned 21. The lighthouse keeper's son with the gentle smile and careful hands. The promise they'd made to each other. 2 pendants. 2 sets of coordinates. 2 halves of one decision they'd never made. Mrs. Chen was watching her with quiet curiosity. "That engraving is quite specific," she said softly. "Those coordinates must mean something special." Maggie nodded slowly. "They do. They mark a lighthouse. Pemaquid Point. I used to know someone who worked there. My late husband was a lighthouse keeper, Mrs. Chen said. At Cape Elizabeth, mostly. But he knew all the lighthouses along this coast." Something in the woman's voice made Maggie look up sharply. "Your husband? Samuel Chen. He passed 3 years ago." The woman's eyes held a kind sadness. "He kept so many things from his lighthouse days. Logbooks, photographs, tools. I'm still sorting through it all." The name hit Maggie like a wave. Samuel Chen. Sam. Her Sam. Except he hadn't been hers for 47 years. Not since that August evening when she'd stood on the lighthouse gallery, watching him prepare for a transfer to Alaska, a promotion, a new beginning, a door opening for him. And she'd let him walk through it alone. They'd talked about going together. Made plans, whispered promises. He'd given her the pendant, and she'd given him its twin. The coordinates were the exact spot where they'd first met, where he'd proposed, where their future was supposed to begin. But at the last moment, fear had won. Her mother had been ill. Her father needed her. The bookshop, this very bookshop, passed down through generations, had been struggling. She'd told Sam to go without her. That she'd follow in a few months. That they'd make it work. But months became years. Letters went unanswered. Calls weren't returned. And eventually, silence. She'd married Robert Hartwell 2 years later. A good man, steady and kind. She'd built a life, raised a daughter, been content. But some part of her heart had stayed at Pemaquid Point, watching a lighthouse beam sweep across dark water, waiting for a ship that never returned. Now, standing in her daughter's bookshop with rain streaming down the windows, holding a pendant that should have been locked away in her closet, Maggie felt something crack open inside her chest. "Are you all right, Mum?" Julia asked, concerned. "You've gone quite pale." Maggie clutched the pendant tighter. "I'm fine. I need some air." She moved toward the door, but Mrs. Chen's voice stopped her. "If those coordinates mean something to you," the elderly woman said quietly, "perhaps you should visit that place again. My Samuel always said lighthouses are memory keepers. They remember what we try to forget." Maggie turned back, meeting the woman's knowing gaze. There was something in those eyes, a recognition, perhaps. A shared understanding of what it meant to love someone and let them go. "Thank you," Maggie whispered. And then she was out the door, into the rain, the pendant clutched in her fist. Behind her, she didn't see Mrs. Chen pull out her phone and dial a number. Didn't hear the quiet conversation that followed. "Lily, dear," Mrs. Chen said after Maggie had gone. "Do me a favor. In my bag, there's a small wooden box. Could you bring it to me?" When Lily returned with the box, Mrs. Chen opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in faded blue silk, was another brass pendant. Identical to the first. Same coordinates. Same inscription. Different initials S. C. Mrs. Chen held it up to the light, watching it spin slowly. "After all these years," she murmured. "After all these years, Margaret Hartwell. You came back." Because Mrs. Chen was not a stranger. She was Samuel Chen's sister, Helen. The woman who'd watched her brother pine for a lost love for 47 years. Who'd held his hand when he died 3 years ago, still wearing that pendant around his neck. The journey was only beginning. But Margaret didn't know that yet. All she knew was that something impossible had just happened. And that the past she'd buried wasn't quite as buried as she'd thought. Maggie's hands were still shaking when she let herself into her small cottage on Maple Street. Rain dripped from her coat onto the hardwood floor, but she barely noticed. She stood in the hallway, pendant still clutched in her palm, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. That pendant should be in her closet. In the wooden box. Where she'd put it 47 years ago and never opened since. Unless she'd taken it out and forgotten. But no, her memory was still sharp. She remembered exactly where she'd left it. Second shelf, behind her winter scarves, in the carved oak box Robert had given her for their 10th anniversary. The box she'd never told him contained someone else's gift. Maggie hung up her wet coat with deliberate care, trying to slow her racing thoughts. Then she walked upstairs to her bedroom. The closet door opened with a familiar creak. She pushed aside the scarves, reached for the box, and pulled it down. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. The tissue paper was exactly as she'd left it, still folded in neat squares. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a brass compass rose pendant, identical to the one she'd just found at the Reading Nook. Maggie sat down hard on the edge of her bed. 2 pendants. Both hers. But that was impossible. Sam had commissioned a local craftsman to make exactly 2. One for him, one for her. There were no others. Which meant the pendant at Julia's shop wasn't hers at all. It was Sam's. But how? And why was it there? She turned over the pendant from the box, reading the inscription she'd memorized decades ago, "For the journey we didn't take." The words cut deeper now than they had at 21. Back then, they'd been romantic, bittersweet. Now they felt like an accusation. Maggie set the pendant carefully on her nightstand and picked up the phone. She needed to talk to someone who'd known her back then. Someone who remembered. Patricia answered on the 3rd ring. "Maggie? What's wrong? You sound breathless." "Pat, something strange just happened." Maggie took a deep breath. "Do you remember Samuel Chen?" There was a pause. "Your lighthouse keeper? Of course I remember. You talked about him non-stop that whole summer. Then he left for Alaska and you. Well, you moved on. Why?" "His sister was at Julia's shop today." "I didn't know he had a sister." "Neither did I. But there was a woman there, Mrs. Chen, they called her. And I found a compass rose pendant. The one Sam gave me. Except mine is still here, in my closet, exactly where I left it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "So there were 3 pendants, not 2? "I don't think so. I think the one at the shop was Sam's. The one he kept. But why would it be there? And who is this Mrs. Chen?" "Maybe it's time you found out," Patricia said gently. "Maybe it's time you stopped running from this." "I'm not running, Maggie." Patricia's voice was firm but kind. "You've been running for 47 years. From the moment you let that boy get on that plane alone, you've been running. Maybe the universe is telling you it's time to stop." After they hung up, Maggie sat in the dimming afternoon light, both pendants now lying side by side on her nightstand. 2 brass circles, catching the last rays of sun through the window. 2 roads not taken. 2 lives that might have been. She picked up Sam's pendant if it was his and held it to her chest. The metal was still warm from her palm. Somewhere out there, someone had kept this for nearly 50 years. Had it been Sam? Had he worn it, the way she'd hidden hers away? Or had he given up on her, the way she'd given up on their promises? Maggie rose and went to her bookshelf. On the bottom shelf, hidden behind a row of gardening books, was a shoebox she hadn't opened in decades. She pulled it out and sat on the floor, feeling foolish and 21 all over again. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, in Sam's careful handwriting. Letters from Alaska, growing less hopeful with each one. The last few simply asking if she was all right, if she'd received the others, if she was ever coming. She'd read the first few when they arrived. Then stopped. It hurt too much to read about his new life, his adventures, his loneliness. Eventually, the letters stopped coming. And she'd told herself it was for the best. Now, holding those yellowed envelopes, she wondered if she'd made the worst mistake of her life. At the bottom of the box was a photograph. Black and white, edges curled with age. Sam in his lighthouse keeper's uniform, young and smiling, standing on the gallery at Pemaquid Point. She was beside him, laughing at something he'd just said, her hand in his. They looked so sure of each other. So certain. What had happened to that certainty? Maggie traced Sam's face with one finger. He'd be 70 now, maybe older. Was he still alive? Still in Alaska? Or had he come back to Maine after all? And this sister Helen Chen, if that's who she was, why had she been at Julia's shop? Why had that pendant appeared now, after all these years? Maggie's practical side wanted to dismiss it as coincidence. Portland wasn't that large. People crossed paths. But her heart, the part she'd kept locked away, whispered something different. This wasn't coincidence. This was a door, slowly opening. And she had a choice: walk through it, or close it forever. She looked at the two pendants again, lying side by side. North and south poles of the same compass. Two people who'd promised to never lose each other, then spent half a century apart. Maggie made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go back to the Reading Nook. She would find Mrs. Chen. She would ask the questions she should have asked 47 years ago. Because Patricia was right. She'd been running long enough. The next morning broke clear and cold, the kind of November day that made everything in Maine look sharp-edged and honest. Maggie stood at her kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee she'd barely touched, watching frost melt on the backyard fence. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., the two pendants sitting on her nightstand like small brass accusations. Every time she'd tried to sleep, her mind had spun with questions. At 9:30, there was a knock at her door. Patricia stood on the porch, two bakery boxes balanced in her arms. "I brought muffins and determination. You're going to need both." "Pat, I didn't ask you to." "No, but you were going to sit here all morning talking yourself out of doing what you know you need to do." Patricia swept past her into the kitchen, setting the boxes on the table. "So I'm here to prevent that." "Coffee?" Despite everything, Maggie smiled. They'd been friends for 40 years, met when Patricia first opened her medical practice in Portland, and Maggie had brought Julia in for a checkup. Some friendships were born from shared history. Others, like theirs, were built on shared understanding. Patricia knew how to read her better than anyone. "The coffee's already made," Maggie said, pulling down a second mug. "Though I'm not sure I can eat anything." "You will." Patricia opened the first box, revealing blueberry muffins still warm from the oven. Because running on an empty stomach and anxiety is a recipe for bad decisions. "Sit." They sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window, throwing long shadows across the worn wood. Patricia buttered a muffin with steady, practiced hands. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Not the version where you try to convince yourself it doesn't matter. The real version." So Maggie did. She told Patricia about the rain, about ducking into Julia's shop, about the pendant found on the floor, about Mrs. Chen and the name that had stopped her heart, about coming home to find her own pendant exactly where she'd left it, which meant the other one, Sam's one, was somehow in her daughter's bookshop. She told Patricia about the letters she'd never fully read, the promises she'd broken, the life she'd chosen instead. "And now I don't know what to do," Maggie finished quietly. "Because if that was really Sam's pendant, it means..." "What? That he kept it? That he never forgot?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. Finally, she said, "Can I tell you something about regret?" "Always the doctor," Maggie said with a weak smile. "Always the friend," Patricia corrected. "When I was doing my residency, there was a patient elderly gentleman, maybe 75. Came in with chest pains. Turned out to be minor, but while he was in the hospital, he kept asking for someone named Eleanor. His daughter said Eleanor was his first love, from before the war. He'd never married her. Life got in the way." "Did they reunite?" "No. Eleanor had died 20 years earlier. But here's the thing, he'd spent 50 years wondering. 50 years of, what if? And on what turned out to be his deathbed, that's what he regretted most. Not the marriage that didn't happen, but never knowing for certain how she'd felt. Never asking the questions that mattered." Patricia reached across the table and took Maggie's hand. "The universe doesn't often give us second chances, Maggie. But when it does, we'd be fools not to take them. What if it makes everything worse? What if finding out the truth is worse than not knowing? Is it? Patricia's eyes were gentle but firm. Because from where I'm sitting, you've been carrying this, not knowing, for 47 years. How's that working out for you? Maggie looked away, blinking back unexpected tears. I loved Robert. I had a good life with him. I know you did, and I'm not saying you didn't. But Robert's been gone 8 years now. And you're still here, still alive, still allowed to want answers to old questions. That's not betraying anyone. That's just being human. They sat in silence for a moment, the clock on the wall ticking steadily, marking time that couldn't be recovered but might still be understood. What would you do? Maggie finally asked. Patricia smiled. I'd eat this muffin, put on my good coat, and walk down to that bookshop. I'd ask to speak with Mrs. Chen, and I'd find out exactly how that pendant ended up on her floor. Just like that? Just like that. Patricia squeezed her hand. Maggie, you've spent your whole life being careful. Being responsible. Putting everyone else first. Your mother, your father, the bookshop, Robert, Julia. You've been the steady one, the reliable one. But you know what? You're allowed to be the brave one too. I don't feel very brave. Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the thing anyway. Patricia stood up, brushing muffin crumbs from her hands. And I'll tell you something else, you're stronger than you think. You always have been. After Patricia left, Maggie sat at the table for another 20 minutes, the pendants laid out in front of her like evidence in a case. She wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But in her heart, she knew Patricia was right. She'd been living with questions for 47 years. Maybe it was time to start looking for answers. She picked up Sam's pendant. She'd started thinking of it as his and held it up to the light. The coordinates were still there, etched permanently into the brass. 4339 in, 7015 feet W. Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. The place where she'd said yes to a future they never built. Maybe, she thought, it was time to go back there. Not to reclaim the past, but to understand it. And to finally, let it go. Or, perhaps, to discover it wasn't quite as finished as she'd believed. Maggie stood, her decision made. She would go to the Reading Nook today. She would find Mrs. Chen. And she would ask the question that had been sitting in her chest for nearly 50 years. Did Samuel Chen ever talk about me? It was a simple question. But the answer might change everything. The Reading Nook looked different in morning light. Softer, somehow. The hanging plants in the windows caught the sun, throwing green shadows across the wooden tables. A few customers browsed the shelves, their quiet movements creating a peaceful rhythm. Julia looked up from behind the counter when the bell chimed, surprise crossing her face. Mum? Twice in 2 days? Are you feeling all right? I'm fine, dear. Maggie unbuttoned her coat slowly, buying time. I just thought I might browse a bit. You hate browsing. You always say you come in knowing exactly what you want. Julia's eyes narrowed with concern. What's really going on? Before Maggie could answer, a voice came from the back room. Julia, dear, where did you put those new bookmarks? Mrs. Chen emerged, carrying a box of inventory. She stopped when she saw Maggie, and something flickered across her face, recognition, perhaps, or expectation. Mrs. Hartwell, she said quietly. I wondered if you might return. The two women stood looking at each other across the shop. Julia glanced between them, confused. Do you two know each other? Not yet, Mrs. Chen said. But perhaps we should. She set down the box and gestured to a small seating area near the window. Would you like some tea, Mrs. Hartwell? I find morning conversations go better with tea. Maggie nodded, not trusting her voice. Julia brought them both cups of Earl Grey, still looking puzzled, but wisely didn't ask questions. She retreated to the register, leaving them alone. Mrs. Chen sat across from Maggie, her hands wrapped around her teacup. Up close, Maggie could see the family resemblance, something in the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth. "You're his sister," Maggie said quietly. "Samuel's sister. Helen." Mrs. Chen smiled slightly. "He told you about me?" "A little. He said you were 10 years older. That you practically raised him after your parents passed. 12 years older, actually. But yes." Helen sipped her tea. "And he told me about you. Quite a lot, actually. Though he never said your first name, always just M. I didn't know it was Margaret until yesterday." Maggie's heart was pounding. The pendant. The one Lily found. It was his, wasn't it? Yes. How did it end up here? Helen was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Samuel came back to Maine 3 years ago. After his wife passed. He'd spent most of his life in Alaska, but at the end, he wanted to come home. He bought a small house near Cape Elizabeth. Close to me. Wife." The word landed like a stone in still water. Of course Sam had married. What had she expected? That he'd spent 47 years pining for her? "He wore that pendant every day," Helen continued. "Even after he married Susan. Even after their children were grown." Susan understood. She was a good woman. She knew there were parts of Samuel's heart that had been spoken for long before she met him. "I didn't know," Maggie whispered. "I didn't know he came back. He didn't announce it. Just came quietly. He spent a lot of time at the lighthouse, the one at Pemaquid Point. Said he was revisiting old memories." Helen's eyes met Maggie's. "He was looking for you, Mrs. Hartwell. Not to disrupt your life, just to know that you were all right." "Did he find me?" "Eventually. He learned you'd married Robert Hartwell, run the bookshop for years. That you had a daughter. He was happy for you, in his way. But he never approached you. Said he'd made his peace with the choices you both made." Maggie felt tears pressing behind her eyes. "Then why is his pendant here?" Helen reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Because before he died, he gave it to me. He said if I ever encountered a woman with the initials M.H. wearing or carrying a compass rose pendant with Pemaquid Point coordinates, I should give her this." She handed the envelope to Maggie. It was addressed simply to M. Maggie's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Sam's familiar handwriting. The penmanship was shakier than she remembered, age and illness evident in every line, but still unmistakably his. "Dear M. If you're reading this, it means Helen found you. I asked her to keep an eye out, figured you might end up in a bookshop eventually. You always did love books more than people. Except maybe me, once. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. Life is too short for guilt, and we both made our choices. I understood why you stayed. I even agreed with it, eventually. Your mother needed you. The bookshop needed you. And I needed to go. But I wanted you to know something. Not a day went by when I didn't think of you. Not a single day. Alaska was beautiful, and Susan was wonderful, and I built a good life. But there was always a part of me standing on that lighthouse gallery, watching you walk away. The coordinates on these pendants, they weren't just a place. They were a promise. And even though we didn't keep it, I never stopped believing in what we felt that summer. So I'm giving you one last gift: permission. Permission to forgive yourself. Permission to remember us without guilt. Permission to know that what we had was real, even though it was brief. And if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. So I can also tell you something I never said: you were the love of my life, Margaret Hartwell. The first one, the truest one. Everyone else was wonderful, but no one was you. I hope you had happiness. I hope Robert was good to you. I hope you don't regret too much. But most of all, I hope that sometimes, just sometimes, when you see a lighthouse, you think of me. Because I promise you, every lighthouse I ever saw made me think of you. Yours, across all the years. Samuel." The tears came then, quiet and unstoppable. Maggie didn't try to hide them. Helen reached across and squeezed her hand. "He was a good brother. A good man. And he carried you with him all his life. I didn't deserve that, Maggie managed. I didn't. I let him go. I let him leave alone. You made a choice, Helen said gently. A hard choice. And he made peace with it. Maybe it's time you did too. Across the shop, Julia was watching them with open concern. Maggie waved weakly, trying to signal that she was all right. But she wasn't all right. She was broken open, all the feelings she'd locked away for 47 years flooding back at once. Samuel had loved her, had remembered her, had thought of her every single day. And she'd convinced herself he'd forgotten her the moment the plane left the ground. Did he? Maggie swallowed hard. Did he suffer? At the end? No, Helen said softly. It was peaceful. He was at home, with his family around him. And he was wearing that pendant. Maggie looked down at the letter still clutched in her hands. Sam's words, Sam's heart, reaching across death to find her. Thank you, she whispered. For finding me. For giving me this. He made me promise, Helen said. Said I should look for a woman his age with sad eyes and a compass rose pendant. Said I'd know you when I saw you. How? Helen smiled gently. He said you'd look like someone who'd spent her whole life wondering if she'd made the right choice. The words cut deep, but they were true. Maggie had wondered. Every year on the anniversary of that August day. Every time she passed Pemaquid Point. Every time she'd found herself thinking, what if? Now she knew. Sam had wondered too. They'd both spent 47 years wondering. And neither of them had been brave enough to find out the answer until it was too late. I'm so sorry, Maggie said. I'm so sorry. Don't be, Helen said firmly. Samuel wouldn't want that. He wanted you to be free. That's why he wrote the letter. That's why he asked me to find you. She pulled out the second pendant, Sam's pendant, and placed it on the table between them. He wanted you to have this. Both of them. Said they belonged together, even if the people wearing them couldn't be. Maggie picked up the pendant, feeling its weight. She pulled out her own from her purse, and laid them side by side. 2 brass circles. 2 sets of coordinates. 2 halves of one story, finally reunited. What do I do now? Maggie asked, her voice small. Helen stood, gathering her teacup. You honor him. You honor what you both felt. And maybe. She paused. Maybe you visit that lighthouse one more time. Say goodbye properly. Some journeys end at the place they began. After Helen left, Maggie sat alone at the table, both pendants in her hand. Julia came over quietly, sliding into the seat Helen had vacated. Mum? What's going on? Maggie looked at her daughter, the life she'd built after Sam left, the proof that her choice had led somewhere good. I need to tell you a story, she said. About the summer I was 21. And about a lighthouse keeper's son who gave me a compass rose and asked me to sail away with him. And you didn't go. No, I didn't go. Julia reached across and took her mother's hand. But he never forgot you. No, Maggie said, tears spilling again. He never did. And sitting in her daughter's bookshop, holding the pendants that had stayed apart for 47 years, Maggie finally let herself grieve not just for Sam, but for the girl she'd been, the choice she'd made, and all the years of wondering that could have been years of knowing. The past couldn't be changed. But maybe, just maybe, it could finally be understood. That evening, Maggie sat alone in her living room, Samuel's letter spread on the coffee table before her. She'd read it a dozen times, each word carving itself deeper into her heart. You were the love of my life, Margaret Hartwell. How many people got to hear those words? And how cruel that she'd only heard them after death had taken the speaker. She traced her finger over his handwriting, careful not to smudge the ink. Even weakened by illness, his penmanship had maintained a kind of dignity. That was Sam all over, steady, careful, taking his time to do things right. She'd thought about him over the years, of course. How could she not? But she'd told herself that what they'd felt was young love, intense but temporary. The kind of romance that burned bright and faded fast. Now she knew different. Sam hadn't faded. He'd endured. And that knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. There was a knock at the door. Through the window, Maggie saw Patricia's car in the driveway. "I brought dinner," Patricia announced, letting herself in with the key Maggie had given her years ago. "And wine. Because you look like you need both." They ate at the kitchen table chicken soup from the deli, crusty bread, a bottle of Chardonnay. Patricia let Maggie tell the story in her own time, not pushing, just listening. When Maggie finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "Do you remember what you told me when Robert died?" she finally said. Maggie shook her head. "You said you were grateful. That you'd had a good marriage, that he'd been kind, that you'd built something solid together. You said you had no regrets." "I didn't. I don't. I believe you," Patricia said. "But Maggie, you're allowed to have loved two men. You're allowed to have chosen one and still grieved the other. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. It feels like betrayal. Robert was good to me. He gave me Julia, gave me stability, never asked me to be anything other than what I was. And Samuel gave you passion, adventure, possibility. Different loves, Maggie. Not lesser or greater. Just different." Maggie picked up Sam's letter, holding it carefully. "He said he thought about me every day. Every single day, Pat. How'd I live with that?" "The same way he did," Patricia said gently. "By accepting that life rarely gives us perfect choices. Only human ones." They sat in silence, the kitchen clock ticking, the November wind rattling the windows. "Helen said I should go to the lighthouse," Maggie finally said. "To Pemaquid Point. To say goodbye properly. That sounds right. Will you come with me?" Patricia smiled. "Of course. When?" "Tomorrow. Before I lose my nerve." That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, both pendants on her nightstand, watching moonlight move across the ceiling. She thought about Sam at 23, eager and earnest, offering her an adventure she'd been too afraid to take. She thought about Sam at 40, married to Susan, building a life in Alaska but still wearing a pendant that bore coordinates to a Maine lighthouse. She thought about Sam at 70, coming back to Cape Elizabeth, walking past her bookshop, knowing she was inside but never going in. Why hadn't he? Pride? Respect for her marriage? Fear of reopening old wounds? She'd never know now. The not knowing, she realized, was its own kind of grief. Around 2 a.m., she got up and pulled out the shoebox of letters again. This time, she read them all. Every single one. The early ones were full of hope, descriptions of Alaska, plans for when she'd join him, promises about the life they'd build together. Then confusion. Had she received his letters? Was she all right? Should he come back? Then hurt, barely concealed beneath formal politeness. He understood she was busy. He knew the bookshop needed her. He'd wait. And finally, acceptance. He'd met someone, Susan, who was kind and loved the outdoors. He wanted Maggie to know he was moving forward. He hoped she'd found happiness too. The last letter was dated September 1979. 2 years after he'd left. "Dear Margaret, this will be my last letter. Not because I'm angry, I'm not. Not because I don't care, I do, more than I should. But because I'm finally understanding that you made your choice when you didn't get on that plane. And I need to respect that. We both need to move forward. I'm going to marry Susan next month. She's wonderful and patient, and she knows about you. She knows there's a part of me that will always be standing on that lighthouse gallery, watching the ocean. But she's willing to love the parts of me that remain. And I'm grateful for that. I hope you're well. I hope the bookshop is thriving. I hope your mother recovered. I hope you found someone who makes you laugh the way you used to laugh with me. Most of all, I hope you don't regret your choice. Because I'm trying very hard not to resent mine. Take care of yourself, Margaret. Samuel." Maggie clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. He'd loved her enough to let her go. And she'd loved him enough to let him leave. But had either of them ever stopped loving? The answer, she now knew, was no. Some loves don't end just because the relationship does. They simply changed shape, becoming memory, longing, the ghost of what might have been. By the time dawn broke, Maggie had made a decision. She would go to Pemaquid Point. She would stand where they'd stood together. And she would finally say the words she'd been too afraid to say 47 years ago. Not, "I'm sorry," but, "I loved you too. I loved you all along." The drive to Pemaquid Point took just over an hour. Patricia drove while Maggie sat in the passenger seat, both pendants in her coat pocket, Sam's letter folded carefully in her purse. The November morning was cold and bright, the kind of day that made the Maine coast look like something from a postcard, all blue sky and granite rocks and pine trees bent by constant wind. They didn't talk much. Patricia understood that some journeys required silence. As they drew closer, Maggie felt her chest tightening. She hadn't been back here since the summer of 1977. Had deliberately avoided it, taking the long way around whenever she needed to visit towns in this direction. But now, watching the familiar landscape slide past the turnoff to Muscongas Bay, the weathered barns, the lobster shacks shuttered for winter, she felt something unexpected. Not just grief, but anticipation. As if she were finally, after all these years, coming home to something. The lighthouse came into view as they rounded the final curve. White tower, black cap, standing sentinel at the edge of the rocky point. The keeper's house beside it had been converted into a museum now, but the lighthouse itself looked exactly as she remembered. Patricia parked in the small lot. Only 2 other cars were there. Off-season meant few tourists. "Do you want me to come with you?" Patricia asked. Maggie shook her head. "I need to do this alone." She walked slowly down the wooden path toward the lighthouse, her boots crunching on gravel. The wind was strong here, carrying the salt smell of the ocean, the cry of gulls. The lighthouse stood before her, and she had to stop for a moment, overcome by memory. This was where Sam had first kissed her. Right here, on this path, after they'd spent the afternoon walking the rocks, talking about everything and nothing. This was where he'd told her he loved her, standing on the gallery at sunset, the light beginning its nightly rotation behind them. This was where he'd given her the pendant, asked her to come to Alaska, offered her an adventure she'd been too afraid to take. Maggie pulled out both pendants, holding them in her palm. The metal was cold, but she could almost feel warmth emanating from them, the warmth of Sam's hands, the last time he'd touched his pendant before asking Helen to find her. She walked to the edge of the rocks, where the granite shelf met the sea. Waves crashed below, powerful and eternal, the rhythm that had been here long before she was born and would be here long after she died. This was the spot. The exact coordinates etched into both pendants. 4339 in, 7015 feet W. She stood there, wind whipping her hair, and closed her eyes. "I'm here, Sam," she said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. "I'm finally here." The wind was her only answer. "I'm so sorry," she continued, tears starting. "I'm sorry I didn't come with you. I'm sorry I stopped reading your letters. I'm sorry I let you go." The waves crashed harder, as if the ocean itself was listening. "But I want you to know something." She opened her eyes, looking out at the horizon where sky met sea. "I loved you. I loved you then, and I never really stopped. Robert was good to me, and I don't regret my life with him. But you were magic, Sam. You were possibility." She pulled out his letter, reading it one more time in the place where they'd made promises they couldn't keep. "You were the love of my life, Margaret Hartwell. You were mine too," she whispered. "I was just too afraid to admit it." She stood there for a long time, letting the wind dry her tears, feeling something inside her chest begin to unknot. Grief, yes. But also something else. Release. Acceptance. Peace. Sam had carried her with him all his life, but he'd also built a good life. He'd loved Susan, raised children, found contentment. He hadn't been destroyed by their parting. He'd been shaped by it. And maybe, she thought, that's what love did. It shaped you. Changed you. became part of the foundation you built everything else on. She didn't need to regret her choice to see that. "Thank you," she said to the wind, the sea, the lighthouse, the ghost of the boy who'd loved her. "Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for coming back, even if I didn't know it. Thank you for the letter." She paused, then added the hardest words, "and thank you for letting me go." Because that's what his letter had done, really. It had released her from the guilt she'd carried for 47 years. Sam had forgiven her long ago. Maybe it was time she forgave herself. Maggie held both pendants up to the light, watching them spin slowly in the wind. 2 brass circles, catching the sun. Then she made a decision. She would keep her pendant, the one she'd hidden away for so long. It was part of her story, part of who she'd been and who she'd become. But Sam's pendant, that belonged here. She'd spent 47 years keeping their love locked away in a box. Sam had spent 47 years wearing it against his heart. Now it was time to let it rest. Maggie knelt at the edge of the rocks, where granite met sea, where their story had begun. She pressed Sam's pendant to her lips once, then gently placed it in a crevice in the rock, wedging it securely so the tide wouldn't take it. "This is yours," she said softly. "This place, this moment, this memory. I'm giving it back to you." The pendant gleamed in its rocky nest, the coordinates still visible, marking a spot that meant something only to 2 people, one of whom was gone. Maggie stood, feeling lighter than she had in years. She walked back to where Patricia was waiting by the car. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked. Maggie thought about it. "Sad," she said finally. "But not broken. Not anymore." They drove back to Portland in comfortable silence, the lighthouse growing smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. Maggie touched her pocket, where her own pendant rested. She would wear it now, she decided. Not hidden away, but out in the open. A reminder not just of what she'd lost, but of what she'd had. A reminder that she'd been loved deeply, truly, and that she'd loved in return. That was worth remembering. 3 days later, Maggie returned to the Reading Nook. Julia was reorganizing the fiction section, while Lily was at the register helping a customer. Helen Chen was in her usual corner, going through a box of what looked like old photographs. Maggie approached slowly. "May I join you?" Helen looked up, smiled. "Of course. I was hoping you'd come back." Maggie sat down, hands wrapped around a cup of tea Julia had automatically prepared for her. Over the past few days, something had shifted in her. The grief was still there, but it no longer felt crushing. "I went to the lighthouse," Maggie said. "To Pemaquid Point. And I left his pendant there. Where we used to stand. It felt right." Helen nodded approvingly. Samuel would have liked that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Helen pushed the box across the table. "I was going through more of his things. Found these. I thought you might want to see them." Maggie pulled the box closer. Inside were dozens of photographs Samuel at various ages, in various places. Alaska landscapes. A wedding photo with a gentle-looking woman who must have been Susan. Children at different ages. Grandchildren. A life, captured in snapshots. And then, buried near the bottom, a photograph that made Maggie's breath catch. It was her. At 21, standing on the lighthouse gallery, laughing at something off camera. She was wearing a sundress, her hair loose in the wind, looking radiantly, impossibly happy. She'd never seen this photo before. Didn't even know it had been taken. "He kept that one in his wallet," Helen said softly. "For 47 years. Even after he married Susan. She knew about it, accepted it. Said everyone was allowed to keep one perfect memory." Maggie traced the edge of the photograph. That girl looked so young, so full of possibility. So unaware that in just a few weeks, she'd make a choice that would echo through the rest of her life. "May I keep this?" she asked. "Of course. That's why I brought it." Maggie continued through the box, and found another photograph, this one more recent. Samuel, maybe in his mid-60s, standing in front of a lighthouse. Not Pemaquid, but a different one. He was older, grayer, but his smile was the same. And around his neck, visible even in the photo, was the compass rose pendant. He never took it off, Helen said. Even when he got sick, even at the very end. The nurses tried to remove it once for an MRI, and he got so upset they let him keep it on. Maggie's eyes filled with tears again. I didn't deserve that kind of devotion. It wasn't about deserving, Helen said. It was about love. Samuel loved deeply. It was just who he was. She pulled another item from the box, a small leather journal, worn with age. This was his. The last year of his life. He asked me to give it to you if I ever found you. Maggie took the journal with trembling hands. Did you read it? Some of it. Enough to know you should have it. That evening, alone in her cottage, Maggie opened the journal. The entries were short, written in Sam's increasingly shaky handwriting. Notes about the weather, observations about birds, little moments with his grandchildren. And scattered throughout, entries about her. October 12, 2021. Drove past the bookshop today. Didn't go in. What would I say after all these years? Hello, remember me? I'm the one you didn't love enough to follow. No, better to leave it. She's built a good life. I can see it in the window displays, hear it in the laughter inside. That's enough. November 3, 2021. Lily started working at the bookshop. Helen's niece. Funny how life circles back. I asked Helen to keep an eye out, to let me know if Margaret seemed happy. She does, Helen says. And that's all I ever wanted for her. January 15, 2022. Getting weaker. Doctor says it's a matter of months now. Not afraid of dying, lived a good life. But there are things I wish I'd said. Questions I wish I'd asked. Did she ever think of me? Did she ever wonder what might have been? Or did she move forward completely, the way I told her to in that last letter? February 28, 2022. Gave Helen the pendant today. Told her if she ever meets a woman named Margaret Hartwell, or even just someone with the initials M.H., wearing or carrying a similar pendant, to give her my letter. Maybe I'm a fool. Maybe she threw her pendant away years ago. But just in case she kept it, the way I kept mine. Just in case some part of her never let go either. The last entry was dated 3 days before he died. March 14, 2022. Dreamed about Pemaquid Point last night. We were young again, standing on the rocks, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the water. In the dream, I asked her again, come with me. In the dream, she said yes. We sailed away together, to Alaska and beyond, to all the places we talked about on those long summer evenings. When I woke up, I was crying. Susan held my hand and didn't ask why. I wonder if Margaret ever dreams about me. I hope she does. I hope I'm not just a footnote in her life, the way she was the whole book of mine. Maggie closed the journal, unable to read any more. He'd been right there, right in Portland, walking past her bookshop. And she'd never known. What would have happened if she had known? If they'd seen each other across the street, or met by accident in a grocery store? Would it have been awkward? Painful? Or would it have brought closure? She'd never know. But reading his journal, she understood something she hadn't before. Sam's love for her hadn't diminished his love for Susan. He'd been capable of holding both. Just as she'd loved Robert while still carrying a piece of her heart that belonged to Sam. Love wasn't a finite resource. It didn't run out just because you gave it to one person instead of another. It expanded, changed, evolved. The girl who'd stood on the lighthouse gallery at 21 would have found that confusing. She'd thought love was all or nothing, you either chose someone or you didn't. But the woman she was now understood differently. You could love multiple people across a lifetime. You could make choices and still wonder about the paths not taken. You could build a good life and still grieve the life you didn't build. All of it was true. All of it was valid. All of it was human. Maggie picked up her pendant, the one she'd started wearing openly now, and held it to her chest. "Thank you, Sam," she whispered to the empty room. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for letting me go. Thank you for coming back, even if I didn't know it. And somewhere, in whatever place existed beyond this one, she hoped he could hear her. Mum, we need to talk. Julia appeared at Maggie's door the next evening, arms crossed, wearing her determined expression, the one that meant she wouldn't be put off or distracted. Maggie sighed. She'd known this was coming. Come in. I'll make tea. They settled in the living room, the November darkness pressing against the windows, a fire crackling in the fireplace. Julia didn't waste time. Helen told me everything. About Samuel Chen, about the pendants, about the letters. Why didn't you tell me? Maggie cupped her hands around her mug. Because it felt like betraying your father. Dad's been gone 8 years. I know, but Maggie struggled to find the words. Your father was a good man. He gave me a good life. I didn't want you to think that I spent our whole marriage pining for someone else. Did you? No. Maggie met her daughter's eyes. I loved your father. Truly. But you loved Samuel Chen too. Yes. In a different way, but yes. Julia was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said something unexpected. I'm glad. Maggie blinked. You're glad? That you had that? That before Dad, before me, before the bookshop became your whole life, you had something just for yourself. Something wild and romantic and impractical. Julia smiled slightly. You were always so responsible, Mum. So careful. It's nice to know you once weren't. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. I was terrified. Of leaving everything I knew. Of disappointing my parents. Of failing at an adventure. So you chose the safer path. Yes. Do you regret it? Maggie thought about that carefully. I regret not being braver. I regret hurting Sam. I regret that I spent so many years wondering instead of knowing. She paused. But I don't regret you. Or the life I built. Or your father. You can regret and be grateful at the same time, Julia said softly. They're not mutually exclusive. That's what Patricia said. Julia leaned forward. Tell me about him. About Samuel. What was he like? So Maggie told her. About the summer of 1977, about meeting Sam at the lighthouse, about long walks on the rocks and longer conversations about everything under the sun. She told Julia about Sam's quiet strength, his steady patience, the way he'd looked at the ocean as if it were a book he was constantly reading. She told her about the proposal, about the pendants, about the coordinates that marked the spot where everything had seemed possible. And she told her about the fear that had won. About watching Sam leave. About the letters she'd stopped reading. About the decades of wondering. He came back, Julia said when Maggie finished. He came back to Portland and walked past the bookshop. Why didn't he come in? Respect, I think. For my choices. For my life. Maggie pulled out Sam's journal, showed Julia the entries. He just wanted to know I was all right. Julia read in silence, tears sliding down her cheeks. This is beautiful and heartbreaking. Most real things are. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the fire. Finally, Julia said, Helen invited us to dinner. Next week. She wants to share more of Samuel's things, photographs, stories, memories. Will you come? Maggie hesitated. I don't know if I can bear much more. I think you can, Julia said gently. I think you're stronger than you realize. And I think. She paused. I think Samuel wanted you to have a complete picture. Not just the sad parts. The happy parts too. You sound like Patricia. Patricia is a smart woman. Maggie smiled despite herself. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best. Julia squeezed her mother's hand. Come to dinner, Mum. Let yourself have this. Let yourself know all of it, not just the parts that hurt. After Julia left, Maggie sat alone with the fire in her thoughts. Her daughter was right. She'd spent 47 years running from this story, hiding from it, pretending it didn't matter. But it did matter. It had always mattered. And maybe it was time to stop running and start understanding. She picked up the phone and called Helen. "I'll come to dinner," she said when Helen answered. "And thank you. For finding me. For keeping Sam's promise. He would have been so happy," Helen said softly. "That you finally know." That night, Maggie slept better than she had in weeks. No dreams of lighthouses or missed trains or decisions that couldn't be unmade. Just peaceful darkness, and the sense that something inside her had finally settled. Helen's house was small and warm, filled with the smell of ginger and garlic and something baking. Maggie arrived with Julia, both of them carrying flowers and wine, feeling oddly nervous. They'd agreed to come early. Helen had said she wanted to show them something before dinner. Helen greeted them at the door, and Maggie was struck again by the family resemblance. Something in the set of the mouth, the calm steadiness of the gaze. Samuel had looked like that too. Come in, Helen said, ushering them inside. "I have everything set up in the living room." The living room was cozy, a worn sofa, comfortable chairs, bookshelves crammed with volumes in both English and Chinese. On the coffee table, Helen had spread out more photographs, carefully organized in chronological order. "Samuel's life," Helen said simply. "I thought you should see all of it." They sat down, and Helen guided them through the years. Baby Sam, held by parents Maggie had never met. Teenage Sam, awkward and earnest in a school photo. Young adult Sam in his lighthouse keeper's uniform, the same photo Maggie had hidden in her own shoebox for decades. Then Alaska. Sam and Susan's wedding. Sam in a suit that didn't quite fit, Susan in a simple white dress, both of them looking nervous and happy. Sam with a newborn baby. Sam with 2 children. Sam with 4 children, 2 biological, 2 adopted. He always wanted a big family, Helen said. Susan couldn't have children after the first 2, so they adopted. He said love didn't need to come from biology. Family vacations, Christmases, birthdays, graduations, more weddings. Sam's children, finding their own paths. Grandchildren, so many grandchildren. He was a wonderful grandfather, Helen said. Patient, kind, always had time for a story or a game. Sam aging, hair going gray, then white. Lines deepening around his eyes. But the smile remained the same. And in every photo, around his neck, the pendant. He was happy, Maggie said softly. He really was happy. Yes, Helen agreed. He was. But he was also. She paused, searching for words. He was also incomplete. That's not the right word. He was whole, but he was always aware that there had been another possible life. Another door he hadn't walked through. She pulled out one more photograph. Samuel in his 60s, standing on a beach at sunset, looking out at the ocean. His expression was peaceful but distant, as if he were seeing beyond the horizon. Susan took this, Helen said. A few years before she died. She said later that she knew what he was thinking about in that moment. He was thinking about you. Maggie's throat tightened. She must have hated me. No, Helen said firmly. She never hated you. She said you were part of what made Samuel who he was. The longing, the what if it taught him to appreciate what he had. To never take her for granted. To love fully while he could. Julia had been quiet through all of this, but now she spoke. Did he ever tell his children about Mum? Helen smiled. In a way. He told them about first love, about choices, about roads not taken. He said everyone has a story that didn't get finished the way they planned, and that was okay. Life wasn't about perfect endings. It was about making the best of the endings you got. She stood up, crossed to a bookshelf, and pulled down a photo album. But there's one more thing I want to show you. Samuel made this in his last year. He called it his Parallel Lives album. She opened it carefully. The album was divided into 2 columns on each page. On the left side were photos of Samuel's life, his wedding, his children, his career, his adventures in Alaska. On the right side were blank spaces. Empty frames where photos should have been. He said this was the life he didn't live, Helen explained. The one with you. He couldn't fill in the frames because he didn't know what they would have looked like. But he wanted to acknowledge that somewhere, in another version of his story, these photos existed. Maggie stared at the empty frames, her heart breaking all over again. In another life, these would have been pictures of her and Sam. Their wedding, their children, their adventures. In another life, she would have gotten on that plane. Why did he make this? She whispered. Because he wanted to honor both lives. The one he lived and the one he didn't. He said they were both real, in their own way. Julia reached over and took her mother's hand, squeezing tight. They looked through the rest of the album page after page of Samuel's actual life on one side, blank spaces on the other. The final page held 2 photos. On the left, Samuel on his deathbed, surrounded by family, wearing the pendant, looking peaceful. On the right, a single blank frame with a note in Samuel's handwriting. This is where Margaret finds her peace too. I don't know what it looks like, but I hope it's beautiful. Maggie couldn't stop the tears this time. They came hard and fast, all the grief she'd been holding back for weeks pouring out. Julia held her while Helen quietly disappeared into the kitchen to check on dinner. When Maggie finally composed herself, she looked at the blank frame one more time. Samuel had left space for her story too. Had acknowledged that while they hadn't shared a life, she'd still had one. And he'd hoped it had been good. That generosity of spirit, that ability to wish well for the person who'd broken your heart, that was Samuel all over. Thank you, Maggie said when Helen returned. For showing me this. For sharing him with me. You were always part of his story, Helen said simply. It seemed right that you should know the whole thing. They ate dinner together, Chinese food Helen had spent all day preparing, sharing stories and memories, filling in gaps. Maggie learned that Samuel had become a naturalist in Alaska, leading tours, teaching people about wildlife. That he'd written 2 books about lighthouse history. That he'd learned to carve wood and had made toys for all his grandchildren. She learned that he'd been a good husband, a devoted father, a beloved grandfather. She learned that he'd lived fully, even with a piece of his heart always anchored in Maine. And in learning all of this, something shifted in Maggie. The guilt began to lift. Because Samuel hadn't been destroyed by their parting. He'd been shaped by it, yes, but not broken. He'd built a beautiful life. And she had too. They'd both gone on. Both found love again. Both created families and legacies. The tragedy wasn't that they'd parted. The tragedy was that they'd both spent so much time wondering instead of accepting. But maybe, Maggie thought as they said goodbye that evening, it wasn't too late for her to accept it now. Samuel had made his peace. Now it was her turn. Spring came slowly to Portland. Snow melted, crocuses pushed through hard ground, and the days grew longer. Maggie stood at her bedroom window one morning in April, watching robins hop across her lawn, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. The pendant hung around her neck. She wore it every day now. Not as a burden, but as a reminder. Of love found, love lost, love remembered. She'd been back to Pemaquid Point twice since that first visit in November. Once alone, in January, to leave flowers on the rocks where she'd placed Samuel's pendant. And once with Julia and Helen, in March, to scatter some of Samuel's ashes in the water. Helen had invited her, said Samuel would have wanted her there. Standing on those rocks with the 2 women who'd loved Samuel in different ways, Maggie had felt something complete itself. A circle closing. A story ending not with tragedy, but with understanding. Today was different though. Today, she had something specific to do. She picked up the phone and called Patricia. Are you free this afternoon? For you? Always. An hour later, they were at the Reading Nook. Julia looked up in surprise. Her mother rarely came in during the middle of the day. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Maggie said. But I need you to do something for me. She pulled an envelope from her purse. Inside was a letter several pages, handwritten, carefully composed. I want you to add this to your memoir section. Not for sale. Just available. For anyone who might need to read it. Julia took the envelope curiously. What is it? My story. Mine and Samuel's. The whole thing, from beginning to end. Maggie smiled. I realized something recently. We spend so much time hiding our regrets, our losses, our roads not taken. But maybe those stories need to be told. Maybe someone else needs to know they're not alone in wondering, what if? She'd spent the past month writing it all down. Every detail she could remember. The summer of 1977, the lighthouse, the pendant, the choice, the 47 years of wondering, and finally, the reunion with Samuel's memory. She'd titled it simply, The Compass Rose. Someone might find comfort in knowing that you can love deeply, make hard choices, and still build a good life, Maggie continued. That regret and gratitude can coexist. That it's never too late to make peace with your past. Julia read the first few pages, tears forming. Mum, this is beautiful. It's honest. That's all I wanted it to be. Helen, who'd been watching from across the shop, came over. Samuel would have loved this. I hope so. Maggie touched the pendant at her throat. I hope somewhere, he knows I finally understood. That evening, Maggie returned to Pemaquid Point one last time. But not alone. Patricia, Julia, and Helen came with her, and they stood together on the rocks as the sun set, the lighthouse beam beginning its nightly rotation. I used to think this place was about loss, Maggie said, watching waves crash below. About the choice I didn't make, the life I didn't live. She paused, then continued. But I understand now. It's not about loss. It's about possibility. About two people who loved each other enough to let each other go. About building different lives and honoring the love that came before. She pulled out a small cloth bag. Inside was a second letter, this one addressed to Samuel. She'd never send it, of course. But she'd written it anyway, pouring out everything she'd never said. The apologies, the gratitude, the love that had never quite faded. She read it aloud, her voice carrying over the wind and waves, the three women beside her bearing witness. Dear Sam, I know you're gone. I know this letter will never reach you in any conventional sense. But I'm writing it anyway, because some things need to be said, even if they're said too late. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for building a beautiful life even after I broke your heart. Thank you for the pendant, for the coordinates that always led back here. Thank you for coming back to Portland, even if you never came into the shop. Thank you for carrying me with you across all those years. I'm sorry I was too afraid to follow you. I'm sorry I let you leave alone. I'm sorry I never answered your letters properly. But I want you to know I loved you too. I loved you when we stood on this spot at 21. I loved you when I married Robert. I loved you when I raised Julia. I loved you when you died, even though I didn't know it yet. Some part of me will always be 21, standing here, watching you walk away, wondering if I made the right choice. But I'm learning to accept that there were no right choices. Only human ones. You built a life I'm proud you had. Susan was lucky to have you. Your children were blessed to know you. Your grandchildren will carry pieces of you forward. In me? I'm learning to carry you forward too. Not with grief, but with gratitude. Thank you for the compass rose. Thank you for the coordinates. Thank you for marking this spot as ours, even if we never came back to it together. I'm here now, and I'm finally at peace. Wherever you are, I hope you're at peace too. Love always. Margaret. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath a stone in the rocks, next to where Samuel's pendant still rested in its crevice. The four women stood in silence as darkness fell and the lighthouse beam swept across the water, steady and eternal. Patricia was the first to speak. That was perfect. He heard it, Helen said softly. I'm sure he heard it. Julia put her arm around her mother. I'm proud of you, Mum. Maggie leaned into her daughter's embrace, feeling lighter than she had in decades. The journey hadn't taken her where she'd expected. It hadn't reunited her with Samuel, hadn't changed the past, hadn't erased the years of wondering. But it had given her something more valuable: understanding. Acceptance. Peace. She'd loved two men in her life. Made different choices for different reasons. Built a life that was good, even if it wasn't perfect. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. As they walked back to the car, Maggie turned one last time to look at the lighthouse. The beam swept across the rocks, steady and sure, marking time, guiding travelers home. And she understood, finally, why Samuel had loved lighthouses so much. They never stopped shining. Even in darkness, even in storms, even when no ships were nearby. They kept faith, kept watch, kept believing that someone, somewhere, needed their light. That's what love did too. It kept shining, even across years and miles and death itself. It kept faith. And maybe, in the end, that was the real gift Samuel had given her. Not just his love, but the proof that real love never dies. It just changes form, becomes memory, becomes story, becomes the light that guides us home. Maggie touched her pendant one last time as they drove away, the lighthouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. "Thank you, Sam," she whispered. "For everything. For the compass rose. For the journey. For the light." And in the darkness behind them, the lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep across the water, keeping watch over the coordinates that marked where two people once stood, young and in love, believing the future was theirs for the taking. Some journeys don't end where they begin. But they always lead us home. 6 months later, Maggie received a letter. It came from Alaska, from a woman named Grace Chen, Samuel's eldest daughter. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell, my Aunt Helen told me about you. About the pendant, the letters, the story my father kept close to his heart all his life. I wanted you to know that we're not angry. My siblings and I, we always knew our father had loved before he met our mother. He never hid it from us. And Mom never resented it. But there's something I wanted to share with you. Last year, when Dad was dying, he asked me to do something. He gave me a small box and told me to open it after he was gone. Inside was a photograph you, at the lighthouse, young and laughing. And a note that said, 'This is where it all began. This is where it all comes back to. Tell Margaret, if you ever find her, that I forgave her a long time ago. Tell her I hope she forgave herself too. So I'm telling you, he forgave you. He wanted you to be happy. He wanted you to know that loving you didn't make him love us any less. It just made him more capable of love, period. Thank you for being part of his story. Thank you for letting Aunt Helen share him with you. Thank you for writing your memoir. We all read it, and we cried, and we understood him better because of it. If you're ever in Alaska, please come visit. We'd love to show you the places Dad loved, share more stories, maybe walk a beach together and scatter some more of his ashes. With gratitude, Grace Chen." Maggie set the letter down, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't sad tears. They were tears of completion. Of gratitude. Of grace. Samuel's children, the family he'd built, were welcoming her into his story. And in doing so, they were completing the circle that had begun 47 years ago. She picked up a pen and began to write back. "Dear Grace, I would love to visit Alaska. I would love to meet you all, see the places your father loved, hear the stories I missed. And maybe, if you'd allow it, I'd like to bring my daughter Julia. So she can see the life I didn't live. So she can understand the roads not taken aren't lost roads, they're just different paths to the same truth. That love matters. That choices matter. That stories matter. And that sometimes, the journey doesn't end where we think it does. With hope. Margaret Hartwell." She sealed the letter, addressed it, and walked to the mailbox. As she dropped it inside, she touched the pendant at her throat one last time. The compass rose. The coordinates. The promise. 4339 in, 7015 feet W. The spot where everything began. The spot where everything, finally, came home. Sometimes love arrives too late. But it still arrives. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every story deserves to be told. Thank you for being here. Margaret found the courage to face her past, Honor what was lost, and embrace what remained. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more stories about love, loss, and second chances. Thank you for being here.